They say blood is thicker than water, but they never tell you what happens when the blood itself turns to poison. They don't tell you how it can curdle in your own veins, turning a mother's love into something cold, hard, and sharp enough to cut. I learned that lesson at the age of 72, sitting at the head of a mahogany table, polished to such a sheen that I could see the reflection of a life I no longer recognized. My name is Eleanor Vance, or it was. Now I prefer Sterling, my maiden name. It feels cleaner. It feels like my own. The name Vance I left behind. A gift, you might say. A parting gift for my only son, Julian. The beginning of the end was a Tuesday. It was the 40th anniversary of Vance and Sterling Innovations, the company my late husband, Robert, and I had bled for, built from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. The celebratory dinner was held at our estate, a sprawling Tudor mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, a house whose every brick and beam was paid for with sleepless nights and sacrificed weekends. Julian, my son, sat to my right. He was 45, handsome in that careless, expensive way that only generational wealth can bestow. He had his father's jawline, but my calculating eyes. Beside him, draped in emerald silk that cost more than my first car, was his fiancée, Serafina. She was a decade younger than him, with hair the colour of spun gold and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was his second fiancée in 3 years, and I disliked her with a quiet intensity that felt like a low-grade fever. I raised my crystal glass of champagne. To 40 years, I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the unease coiling in my gut. To Robert, who I wish was here to see this, and to the future under Julian's leadership. A polite smattering of applause from the board members and their spouses filled the dining room. Julian gave a tight, practiced smile. He didn't look at me. He hadn't truly looked at me in months, not since Serafina had slipped her perfectly manicured claws into his life. Later, after the guests had departed, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and cigar smoke hanging in the air, the three of us stood in the grand library. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the leather-bound books I'd so carefully collected. "Mother," Julian started, his tone clipped and rehearsed. "Serafina and I have been talking about the future, about the company." "I'm listening," I said, sinking into one of the wing-back chairs. My old bones ached, but I would never let him see it. "We feel," he continued, glancing at Serafina, who gave him a tiny, encouraging nod, "that your role as chairwoman of the board is anachronistic. It's an honorary title, and it sends the wrong message to our investors. It suggests I'm not fully in control." I felt a cold dread, slick and oily. "Anachronistic? Julian, I built that company with your father. My name is on the letterhead." "Exactly," Serafina chirped, her voice like honey laced with glass. "Was. Eleanor, you've done a wonderful job, truly. But it's Julian's time. All the major decisions, the strategic direction. It should be his, unfettered." I looked at my son, searching for the boy I once knew, the one who'd run to me with scraped knees and tear-streaked cheeks. I saw only a stranger wearing his face. "And what do you think, Julian?" He squared his shoulders, puffed out his chest, the posture of a king who had forgotten who placed the crown on his head. "I agree with Serafina. It's time for a change. We want to modernize, to streamline. Your lingering presence complicates things." The words hung in the air, suffocating me. Lingering presence, as if I were a ghost haunting my own life. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to anchor myself. "I see. And what exactly are you proposing?" Julian finally met my gaze. His eyes, my eyes, were cold, devoid of warmth or affection. "We're asking you to retire. Fully. Step down from the board. Relinquish your voting shares. They'll be transferred to a trust for me. You'll be well taken care of course. A generous stipend. He said it so casually, as if discussing the quarterly earnings report, as if he were firing a redundant employee, not casting out his own mother. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackle and pop of the burning logs. I stared at him, at the woman whose influence dripped from him like venom, and I felt something inside me snap. The fragile, hopeful part of my heart that had made excuses for his growing distance, that had blamed his grief over his father, his workload, anything but the truth, it shattered. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. No, I said, the word a stone in the quiet room. Julian's face hardened. Mother, don't be difficult. Difficult? A laugh, dry and brittle, escaped my lips. Oh, Julian, you have no idea what difficult is. He took a step forward, his voice rising. This is my company now, my life. I've been running it for 5 years. You just show up for board meetings and collect dividends. You're a figurehead from a bygone era. And then came the words that would echo in the chambers of my heart and become the catalyst for the storm that followed. He gestured dismissively, a flick of his wrist that discarded 72 years of my life. You're not part of my life, Mother. Not the important parts, your history. So just accept the stipend and enjoy your garden parties. The world tilted. The ornate library, the fire, the smug look on Serafina's face. It all blurred into a watercolor of betrayal. He hadn't just insulted me. He had erased me. He had taken everything my husband and I had built, everything I had handed to him on a silver platter, and then told me I was no longer welcome at the feast. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply nodded. A slow, deep nod of understanding. A profound, terrifying clarity washed over me. He was right. I wasn't a part of his life. So I would remove myself, utterly, and I would take all the unimportant, historical, anachronistic pieces with me. Very well, Julian, I said, my voice eerily calm. You're right. It's your time. He looked relieved, a flicker of smug satisfaction in his eyes. Serafina beamed, stepping forward to loop her arm through his. We knew you'd understand, Eleanor. I gave them a smile. It was a ghastly thing, all teeth and no warmth. Oh, I understand perfectly. I walked out of the library, my back ramrod straight. As I ascended the grand staircase, I heard Serafina's triumphant whisper, See? I told you she'd fold. Old people always do. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in my study, the true heart of the house, and I began to work. Julian had made one critical, catastrophic mistake. He saw an old woman. He saw a figurehead. He had forgotten who wrote the rules of the game he was playing. He had forgotten that I wasn't just Eleanor Vance, the widow. I was Eleanor Sterling, the architect. And an architect always knows where the load-bearing walls are. And she knows how to bring the whole damn house down. The first call I made at dawn was to my personal lawyer, David Abernathy. David's father had been my father's lawyer. He was 70, sharp as a tack, and loyal to a fault. David, I said, my voice crisp, it's time. Execute the Sterling protocol. There was a moment of silence on the line, then a low whistle. Eleanor, are you certain? It's the nuclear option. They have left me no choice, I replied. He said I'm not a part of his life. Fine, I'm taking my parts back. The Sterling protocol was a contingency I'd had David draft a decade ago, shortly after Robert died. I'd seen how wealth and power could corrupt, how the children of titans could grow weak and entitled in the shadow of their parents. It was a series of legal instruments, trusts and holding companies, all dormant, all tied to my maiden name, Sterling. A kill switch, if you will. Robert and I had structured the company in a very specific way. Julian owned the majority of the operating shares of Vance and Sterling Innovations. He was the CEO, the public face. But the true assets, The patents for our revolutionary microprocessors, the deeds to the corporate real estate across the globe, the vast and diversified investment portfolio that acted as the company's financial bedrock were not owned by the company itself. They were owned by a series of shell corporations, which were, in turn, leased back to Vance and Sterling for a nominal fee. And who owned those shell corporations? A single master holding company, ES Holdings, Eleanor Sterling Holdings. As long as I was chairwoman of the board, the symbiotic relationship was seamless. The moment I was removed, involuntarily or otherwise, a clause in every single one of those leasing agreements was triggered. The Keystone Clause. It stipulated that all assets would immediately revert to the sole control of ES Holdings. Julian knew nothing about this. He, in his arrogance, had only ever looked at the profit and loss statements of the operating company. He never bothered to read the fine print on the foundational charters, the documents I had made him sign years ago, telling him they were just estate planning formalities. The next 3 weeks were a blur of coordinated, silent, ruthless activity. David and his team worked around the clock. First, the patents. All 2,417 of them, including the source code for our flagship Odyssey AI software, were legally transferred from the shell corporations to a new entity, Sterling Legacy Tech, based in Switzerland. Vance and Sterling Innovations went from being a tech giant to a company that owned a brand name and a lot of office furniture. Next, the real estate. The gleaming corporate tower in Manhattan, the sprawling R&D campus in Silicon Valley, the manufacturing plants in Ireland and Taiwan. The deeds were all transferred. We sold the Manhattan Tower to a competitor in a lightning-fast, all-cash deal. The other properties were mortgaged to the hilt, the capital funneled into my private accounts. Then came the money. The investment portfolio, worth north of $3 billion, was liquidated. Bonds, stocks, futures, all sold. The cash was wired through a labyrinth of banks, from the Cayman Islands to Zurich, finally landing in a new trust under my name, accessible only by me and David. While Julian and Serafina were celebrating their victory, planning a lavish wedding and meeting with designers to remodel my house, I was methodically and legally disemboweling the empire that bore his name. The final piece was the personal assets. The Greenwich estate, the penthouse on Park Avenue, the villa in Tuscany, the art collection, the fleet of cars, all had been placed in a revocable trust by Robert and me years ago. The trustee? Me. I revoked it. I transferred every single asset into my name alone. On the last day, I walked through the Greenwich mansion one last time. Movers, my movers, were discreetly packing my personal belongings, my books, my clothes, the photos of Robert. I left everything else, the furniture, the silverware, the empty suits in Julian's closet. Let him keep the stage. I was taking the set, the script, and the box office receipts. The day of reckoning was a Friday. I arranged for a special board meeting. Julian, annoyed by the summons, swaggered in, Serafina on his arm. He took his seat at the head of the table, the seat that had been mine. "Let's make this quick," he said. "Serafina and I have a tasting menu to approve at per se." I smiled from my position at the other end of the table. David Abernathy sat at my right, a thick stack of documents in front of him. "This won't take long, Julian," I said. "I'm here to tender my resignation as chairwoman." A look of pure triumph flashed across his face. Serafina squeezed his hand under the table. "Excellent," he said. "We've prepared a generous severance package in recognition of your years of service." "That won't be necessary," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the tense room. "My resignation triggers certain consequences." "David?" David began to speak, his dry, legalistic voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. He laid it all out. The Keystone Clause, The reversion of assets, the liquidation of the portfolio, the sale of the headquarters. With each sentence, the colour drained from Julian's face. His arrogant smirk faltered, replaced by a mask of confusion, then dawning horror. What are you talking about? He stammered, looking around at the other board members, who were now looking at their shoes, their faces pale. They had all received the briefing documents an hour earlier. I'm talking about the difference between running a company and owning it, Julian, I said, my voice cold as ice. You were the driver of a very expensive car, but you never bothered to check who held the title. I did. Vance and Sterling Innovations is now a shell. It has massive operational overhead, a full staff on payroll, and contractual obligations it cannot possibly meet. Its assets, as of this morning, consist of its office leases, which are now with a new and far less friendly landlord, and its brand name. A name which is about to become synonymous with the most spectacular corporate collapse in modern history. Serafina was the first to find her voice. You can't do this. It's illegal. David cleared his throat. I can assure you, Miss Dubois, every action taken is perfectly legal, meticulously documented, and utterly binding. We have copies for your perusal. He slid a thick binder across the polished table. It stopped in front of Julian with a heavy, final thud. Julian stared at the binder, then at me. The bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate panic. My shares. My trust. Your shares are in a company that is now effectively bankrupt, I said flatly. Your trust is intact. You are the proud beneficiary of a fund that contains nothing of value. You wanted the Vance name? You have it. It's all you have. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. Why? He roared, his face a contorted mask of fury and disbelief. Why would you do this to me? I'm your son. I rose to meet his gaze, the years of buried pain and silent disappointment fueling my resolve. You told me I wasn't a part of your life. I simply decided to believe you. You can't have the fruits of my life if I am not allowed to be a part of yours. You wanted to be unfettered, Julian. Well, now you are. You are completely and utterly free of the burden of the empire your father and I built. I turned to leave. At the door, I paused and looked back at him. He stood there, trembling, his world having crumbled to dust in the space of 10 minutes. Serafina was already backing away from him, her face a picture of horrified calculation as she realized she'd hitched her wagon to a pauper. Oh, and one more thing, I said, my voice calm. The locks on the Greenwich house, the penthouse, and the villa have been changed. The credit cards tied to the corporate accounts were cancelled an hour ago. I'd suggest you find a hotel, and I'd pay in cash if I were you. I walked out and didn't look back. The first 6 months were intoxicating. I had my revenge. I watched from afar as the news broke. Vance and Sterling in shock collapse, the headlines screamed. Julian was eviscerated in the press, portrayed as an incompetent fool who had flown his family's legacy into the ground. He was buried in lawsuits from creditors and shareholders. Serafina, of course, vanished. The last I heard, she was on a yacht in the Mediterranean with a Russian oligarch. I moved into a beautiful modern penthouse overlooking Central Park. It was smaller than the Greenwich mansion, but it was mine, filled with my things, my memories. I started a new, smaller, more agile company, Sterling Legacy Tech, built on the bedrock of my old patents. It was successful, invigorating. I was Eleanor Sterling again, sharp, respected, powerful. I had won. But victory, I discovered, is a cold companion. The silence in my new apartment was absolute. There were no family dinners, no calls from my son, not even hateful ones. I had surgically excised him from my life, and in doing so, I had created a wound that ached with a phantom pain. I had avenged the betrayal, but I had cemented the loss. I had proven my point, but I was utterly, profoundly alone. This is where the story should end. The vengeful matriarch, triumphant and isolated, a modern-day Medea in a corner office. But karma, as it turns out, is not a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It's a slow, creeping vine. It works its way into the cracks of your certainty and splits it wide open. My karma began with a manila envelope delivered by courier a year after the collapse. It had no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photo was old, faded. A young man with a familiar, hungry look in his eyes stood with his arm around a young woman. The man was a failed business partner from our early days, a brilliant engineer named Marcus Thorne, whom Robert had ruthlessly pushed out of the company, buying his shares for pennies on the dollar just before our first big breakthrough. We'd ruined him. I'd always felt a twinge of guilt about it, but Robert had insisted it was just business. The young woman in the photo was a teenage girl with spun gold hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The note had only one sentence. "You took my father's legacy, so I took your son's." I dropped the photo. Serafina. Her real name wasn't Serafina Dubois. It was Sarah Thorne. I called David Abernathy immediately, my hands trembling. Find everything you can on a man named Marcus Thorne and a Sarah Thorne. The information came back within days, and it laid my soul bare. Marcus Thorne, after we had forced him out, had fallen into a deep depression, losing what little money he had in a series of bad investments. He died by suicide when his daughter, Sarah, was 19. She had put herself through college, working 3 jobs, nursing a cold, patient hatred for the family she blamed for her father's destruction. It was all there, her meticulous years-long plan, changing her name, working her way into the social circles where she knew she would meet Julian. Seducing him wasn't just gold digging, it was an act of espionage. She hadn't wanted the Vance money, she had wanted to burn the Vance name to the ground. She had identified the weak point in my family's fortress, my arrogant, entitled son. She had whispered poison in his ear, nurtured his resentments, and pushed him to confront me, knowing it would provoke a war. And I, in my pride and my pain, had been her willing, unwitting weapon. She hadn't destroyed my son. I had. She had simply loaded the gun and pointed me at him. My grand, dramatic revenge was nothing more than the final bloody act in her own. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The intoxicating sense of victory curdled into shame. I had to find him. It wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about truth. My PI found him within a week. He wasn't in New York or London. He was in a small, dreary town in Ohio, working as a manager at a lumber yard. He was living in a small rented apartment above a hardware store. He was using his middle name, Robert. Julian Vance was a ghost. I flew to Ohio. I didn't call. I just showed up. I stood on the cracked pavement outside the lumberyard, a 73-year-old woman in a cashmere coat, looking at a man I barely recognized. He was thinner. The expensive haircut was gone, replaced by something rough and unstyled. His hands were calloused. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary hollowness. He looked broken. He saw me and froze, a piece of 2x4 in his hand. For a moment, I thought he would tell me to leave. Instead, he just dropped the wood and stared. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rough. "We need to talk," I said. We sat in a cheap diner that smelled of stale coffee and grease. It was a million miles away from the mahogany-polished world we once inhabited. I slid the manila envelope across the sticky Formica tabletop. He opened it, looked at the photo, read the note. He showed no reaction at first, just a deep, still emptiness. "Her name was Sarah," I said softly. "Sarah Thorne. Do you remember Marcus Thorne?" He nodded slowly. Dad mentioned him once, said he was dead weight. I took a breath. Your father and we destroyed him, Julian. We took his work, his shares, everything. We were young and hungry and ruthless. We told ourselves it was just business. But it broke him. His daughter, Sarah. She spent her entire adult life planning to do the same to us. I told him everything, the whole sordid story. I didn't spare myself. I confessed my own culpability, the original sin that had planted the seeds of this tragedy 40 years ago. He listened, without interruption. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. So, he finally said, a bitter, humorless smile touching his lips. It was never about me at all. I was just a tool, a pawn in a game that started before I was born. You were her tool, I said, and you were my son. I should have seen it. I let my pride. You let your pride do exactly what she knew it would do. He finished for me, his voice flat. You were as predictable as I was. He looked up at me then, and for the first time, I saw not just emptiness, but a flicker of the old anger. Does this make it better, Mother? Does this story change the fact that you tore my life to shreds? Does it excuse you? No, I whispered, the word catching in my throat. Nothing excuses me. I just thought you should know the truth. The truth, he scoffed. The truth is, I told you that you weren't a part of my life, and you proved me right. You chose the money, the company, the power. You always did. Sarah just gave you the perfect excuse. His words were a knife in my heart, because I knew, deep down, there was a shard of truth to them. Had my revenge been purely about my hurt feelings? Or was it also about protecting my legacy, my control? I couldn't untangle the two. They had become one and the same. I left Ohio that day with nothing resolved. The chasm between us was as vast as ever, but something had shifted. The clean, sharp lines of villain and victim had blurred into a messy, heartbreaking grey. I didn't hear from him for another 6 months. I ran my new company, but the fire was gone. My victory felt like ashes in my mouth. Then, one day, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I'm in New York, he said, his voice hesitant. I got a job with a construction firm, a foreman. I held my breath. That's good, Julian. I've been thinking, he said, about what you said, about Marcus Thorne, about everything. I was an arrogant fool. I was a terrible son. And I was a terrible mother, I replied, tears welling in my eyes. There was a long pause. Yeah, he said, and I could hear the faintest hint of a sad smile in his voice. Well, maybe we could be terrible people together sometime. Get a coffee? We started there. Coffee. Once a week. In a neutral cafe halfway between my penthouse and his small apartment in Queens. It was awkward. There were long silences. The ghosts of Robert and Sarah Thorne and billions of dollars sat at the table with us. We couldn't go back. The damage was too deep, the scars too permanent. The Vance and Sterling empire was gone forever. The trust was broken in ways that could never be fully repaired. But we were talking. He told me about his job, the satisfaction of building something real with his hands. I told him about my plans to turn Sterling Legacy into a foundation for ethical tech startups, a way to atone for the sins of the past. He hasn't called me mother yet. He just calls me Eleanor. And I don't call him my son. I call him Julian. We are two strangers, bound by blood and wreckage, cautiously learning to map the ruins of what we once were. He never got the fortune back. I left him the Vance name, and I took everything else. But in the end, karma came for me too. It took my victory. It took my certainty. It took my pride. It left me with something far more complicated and far more valuable. A second chance. A chance not to rebuild an empire of wealth, but to try, brick by painful brick, to rebuild the fragile, broken thing called family.